breathless hysteria, conspiracy theories, fake news story after fake news story, every minute, every hour, every 24-hour day, every week, every month, as they work in concert with their partners, the Democratic Party. Nothing but a mere extension. And the man who is exposing all of this, well, he's out with a brand new book. He is the host of the #1 show right here on the Fox News Channel Sunday nights, the host of Life, Liberty, and Levin. And, of course, he has his nationally syndicated radio show and author right there, Unfreedom of the Press. There's a reason I call him the Great One. He's a great personal friend. My brother, how are you?
God bless you, bro. How are you?
You know, what I love about your books, Liberty, Tyranny, everything, you go through such detail, historical detail. You know, before I get to these idiots that we're playing here, you know, you do remind us about the press in the past. And I remember you told the story, for example, how they treated Jefferson, the brutal battle between Quincy Adams and Hamilton. I mean, that went off the ledge in some ways. But today's very different. So my first question is, why did you want that context in history there?
First of all, I want the American people to understand that freedom of the press is their freedom of the press. It doesn't belong to CNN. It doesn't belong to MSNBC. Free speech, freedom of the press, they're both in the First Amendment for a reason. When this country was started, it was the pamphleteers, a handful of newspaper men, the printers. They were great, great patriots. And these were the men who pushed for revolution, who pushed the ideas, who talked about philosophers like Locke and Montesquieu and so forth.
Which you have done in your past books.
Which I have in my past books. But these were the people. The printing press, there were only a few of them. They had to move them from time to time because the British were trying to find them and hunt them down. They pushed these ideas. Thomas Paine was a great pamphleteer. There were many, many others. And what would happen is people would read these pamphlets, they'd talk about them at their pubs, at their homes, at the dinner table, and word would spread. Common Sense, Thomas Paine's pamphlet. It's estimated 120,000 people read it. There was a country of about 2 million people, and by the time it was over, 500,000 people had read it. It had enormous influence. Why is it important? Because back then, what did our press, they didn't call themselves the press, but what did the press do? Promoted liberty, individualism, representative government, private property rights, low taxes, and so forth. And then from that period, soon thereafter, we had a party press, and it was brutal. And the press would at least be transparent. They would identify with a political party, with a candidate, with a cause. And Thomas Jefferson and John Adams would really duke it out. Some of the people in the press were actually on the payroll of a political party and so forth. But they were all open about it. Again, it was very, very ugly. Then you move into a period of, and that lasted from about 1780 to the Civil War. Let's jump forward to the early part of the last century, the progressive movement. Well, they devoured much of our government. Their ideology did. It does today. They devoured the so-called media at the time, too. They wanted to professionalize it. They wanted standards. They said, we need to be more objective. But they said, we need to have a handful of elites, a handful of people who understand the country, who understand the world, through which all of this will be laundered, which is the way they view government, too. The people are stupid, the people are plebes, they're too busy or they're too ignorant. Let us tell them what to think. Today's media, that's their heritage, but they've taken it a step further. They're social activists. That's what they are. They're being taught this in journalism school. It's not enough to report the facts. It's not enough to be objective, they argue, whatever that means. We have to push an agenda. Some of them are out of the closet, and they admit that we need to push the liberal or progressive agenda. Some of them, when you challenge them, they say you're attacking freedom of the press, and they pretend that they're still objective when they're not. Survey after survey, study after study shows half of the country, the vast majority of Republicans, the vast majority of people who lean conservative or are conservative, do not trust the media. And there's a reason for it. Another half do. Democrats and liberals think the media is pretty darn good. So when you lose the trust of half the country, you're not doing your job. And they're not doing their job. They play to a niche. Even the word objective is debated. Do we mean objective in terms of the thinking of the journalist? Do we mean objective in terms of the process? So they pretty much have surrendered that. You know, a couple months ago, Chuck Todd, on Meet the Press, he declared that man-made climate change is a fact. And we're not going to allow deniers. We're not going to allow deniers on Meet the Press. He's more than the host of Meet the Press. He's the chief political guru for the entire NBC network.
Mark, you've seen they have a whole so-called news channel that's a conspiracy channel.
MSNBC.
It's sort of like Roswell, New Mexico every night over there.
But this is an enormous disservice to the American people. Chuck Todd doesn't know the first thing about climate change or so-called climate change. You have physicists, you have PhDs, climatologists, meteorologists, not just hundreds of them, thousands of them, who debate man-made climate change, debate its effect, debate if it exists, and he has declared, we're not going to allow that on my show. So that demonstrates to you he's pushing an agenda. This whole Russia collusion thing. What I write about in the book also, Sean, is the notion of news versus propaganda versus pseudo-events. The President of the United States is really onto something. When he talks about fake news, there was a brilliant historian, University of Chicago, Daniel Borstein, who became head of the Library of Congress. He wrote a book on pseudo-events. And he was talking about the news, among other things. They create their own reality by how they choose events, how they create events, how journalists promote themselves through drama. You see it with Jim Acosta, who creates conditions where the focus is on him and not the news. This is an enormous disservice to the American people. Pseudo-news. Russia collusion with the Trump campaign. We had 2.5 years of pseudo, as the president calls it, fake news. And pseudo-news requires more pseudo-news. So, obstruction. A pseudo-event. It didn't really happen, but they claim it. 700 former prosecutors writing a letter, all liberals, no doubt. There are thousands and thousands of former prosecutors. Another pseudo-event. Phony subpoenas that are intended to gather information that had to do the American people any good, that have nothing to do with congressional oversight. Pseudo-events. This impeachment debate. Absolutely phony, another pseudo-event. Meanwhile, there's all kinds of events taking place in the world and in this country that are not being covered by news organizations. There's some exceptions, but in the aggregate, this is the condition we face. This is an enormous disservice to the American people. Remember this. The First Amendment belongs to the American people. The Bill of Rights belongs to the American people. The Constitution belongs to the American people. When they say Donald Trump is like a dictator because he calls the media or a media outlet or a media person the enemy of the people, they have no idea what they're talking about. Donald Trump points out, questions them, is harsh in his rhetoric, and ought to be. And you have Acosta in a few weeks who's going to write a book and say, we basically have never seen anything like this, Sean. Let me give you a little history lesson.
It's in the book.
All of this is in the book. Let me give you a little history lesson. The sedition.
I just wanted to tell our audience, this is a very hard interview for me. No, but this is honestly the amount of work, because I've been in your house when you do your books.
You see them stacked up.
I mean, it is an entire 2 rooms full of books and papers, and I don't know how you do it. But I'll keep going. I just want people to know how much history is in this.
Because I'm a nerd, what can I say?
No, well, we need a lot of nerd. You mentioned Thomas Paine. Think about what he said, Mark, and this history that you're going through. Government in its best state is but a necessary evil, and its worst state an intolerable one. But continue.
The media says Donald Trump is the greatest threat, or some of them do, to freedom of the press we've ever seen. That is a flat-out lie. They are historical illiterates. Let's start quickly. John Adams. John Adams was one of the great founders, and he was a great man and a great writer about liberty and all things. So he and his party put in place the Alien and Sedition Act. But the Sedition Act is if you criticize that president, you criticize his party, you criticize the government, he has the power to imprison you. And you know what? He imprisoned some journalists and he shut down some newspapers. Jefferson was furious. Jefferson was a libertarian. And he runs against Adams, among other things, against the Alien and Sedition Act. He wins in a brutal campaign, and I won't get into all the details, but he wins, and he gets rid of the Sedition Act. And the media attack him and brutalize him and so forth. That is the party press. The party press that supported Adams and Hamilton and his part and that party would viciously attack him, and he would still say, I'm not going to touch it. Abraham Lincoln, during the Civil War, through his Secretary of War, Stanton, shut down approximately 300 newspapers and imprisoned a slew of journalists, among others, because they felt they needed to, whatever your argument is, they felt they needed to because of the Civil War. Woodrow Wilson, one of the great progressive intellectuals who became president of the United States almost by accident, he went further. He put a new Sedition Act in place in 1918, and an extension of the Espionage Act. We're familiar with that. And what he and his party did is they went after journalists they disagreed with. They went after political opponents they disagreed with. They put him in jail. He also put in place an extensive censorship campaign and an extensive government propaganda campaign. The great progressive Franklin Roosevelt turned the IRS on newspapers he disagreed with. The owner of the Enquirer was investigated by the IRS at his direction. Gannett was investigated at the direction of Eleanor Roosevelt, so they would use the IRS. Kennedy did too. Barack Obama. This is recent history. The FBI, the Department of Justice, went after the New York Times. James Rosen went after James Rosen of this network. Went after 20 reporters at the Associated Press. Barack Obama. Donald Trump hasn't done any of these things, and to call him the greatest threat to the press is an absolute outrage.
This is just a primer. This is all in this book. The history is phenomenal. They even bring up in presidential elections charges of bigamy and dueling, and you show this history, and it's fascinating to see how it has evolved, but I also want to bring it into current day. And I do believe the president's branding of fake news will forever be tattooed in their foreheads because of how low they have sunk. The book's phenomenal, Unfreedom of the Press. We continue with the great one, Mark Levin. When we come back, we'll discuss the media's unhinged coverage of the Russia probe and their meltdown the night Donald Trump was elected, as a special edition of Hannity